Every empire in history, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, eventually does the same thing. They debase their currency. They reduce the value of their money. Rome did it, Byzantium did it, the Ottomans did it, Weimar Germany did it, and every modern nation is doing it right now. This isn't a coincidence. It's not incompetence. It's the inevitable endgame of imperial finance. And once you see why, you can't unsee it. Let's start with Rome, the empire that defined Western civilization for 1,000 years. In 64 AD, under Nero, the silver denarius was the backbone of Roman commerce. It contained about 95% pure silver. Soldiers were paid in denarii. Taxes were collected in denarii. Trade across the Mediterranean ran on denarii. The coin was trusted because it had real, intrinsic value. But Rome had a problem. A growing empire is expensive. Legions on every border, massive road networks, aqueducts, grain subsidies for the urban poor, and constant draining wars. The costs kept rising while tax revenue simply couldn't keep pace. So the emperors found a clever solution. They reduced the silver content of the denarius. Nero started it. He dropped the silver content from 95% to 90%. It wasn't a huge change, and most people didn't notice. The coin still looked the same and weighed roughly the same, but suddenly, the empire could mint more coins from the same amount of silver. It was a form of invisible taxation. The next emperor continued the practice. Then the next. By the time of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, the denarius was only about 75% silver. By the reign of Septimius Severus in 200 AD, it was down to 50%. By the crisis of the 3rd century, around 270 AD, the denarius was barely 5% silver. It was essentially a copper coin with a thin silver wash. The consequences were predictable and devastating. Inflation exploded. Prices soared. A measure of wheat that cost half a denarius in the 1st century cost thousands by the 3rd century. Soldiers, no longer trusting the currency, demanded payment in gold or goods. Trade broke down, the economy contracted, and the empire, unable to fund its military or maintain order, began to fracture. This wasn't incompetence. Roman emperors knew exactly what they were doing, but they felt they had no choice. The empire needed money, and taxes were already cripplingly high. Raising them further risked open rebellion. Cutting military spending meant losing territory to invaders. Debasement was the only option that bought time without an immediate political cost. You'd think the world would learn from Rome's collapse, but no. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's successor in the East, repeated the same mistakes. The Byzantine solidus, introduced by Constantine in 312 AD, was initially pure gold. For centuries, it was the most trusted currency in the world, the dollar of the Middle Ages. But by the 11th century, familiar pressures returned. Constant wars, declining revenues, and rising costs. So, what did they do? They debased the solidus. By the time of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, it was worth just a fraction of its original value. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the currency was nearly worthless. The pattern repeated all across medieval Europe. The English pound sterling was originally a literal pound of pure silver. Over the centuries, it was debased repeatedly. By the time of Henry VIII in the 1540s, the silver content had dropped so low that the king's profile on the coins began to wear off, revealing the copper underneath. This earned him the nickname Old Copper Nose. This debasement funded Henry's lavish court and his wars. But it also triggered crippling inflation that devastated the English economy for decades. The logic is always the same. Empires and governments expand. Their commitments, military, social, and bureaucratic, always grow. These commitments cost money, often more money than can be raised through direct taxation, without causing a revolt. So, they turn to the printing press, or in ancient times, the mint. They create more money out of thin air, diluting the value of every existing unit of that currency. It's a stealth tax on everyone who holds the money. It transfers wealth from the people to the state, from the silver denarius of Rome to the gold solidus of Byzantium, from the English pound to the German mark and the modern US dollar. The story is remarkably consistent. The pressures of empire, of war, and of ever-expanding government lead to the debasement of currency. It's a slow-motion default, a hidden tax that erodes savings and destabilizes the economy. It's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's the financial endgame of empire. And understanding this pattern is crucial because it's happening all around us right now. The Ottomans followed the same path. The akçe, the Ottoman silver coin, was stable for centuries. But by the 1580s, the empire was overstretched. Wars with Persia and Austria consumed resources, so they debased the akçe year after year. By the 1640s, it was worth 1/5 of its original value. Inflation ravaged the empire. Janissaries revolted. The empire entered a long, slow collapse. Every case follows the same logic. Empires expand. Expansion is expensive. Tax revenues can't keep up. Borrowing has limits, so they debase the currency. It's invisible, it's easy, and it works, until it doesn't. The most dramatic example in modern history is Weimar Germany. After World War I, Germany faced impossible reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded payments in gold and foreign currency that Germany didn't have, so the government printed money. Reichsmarks poured from the printing presses in unprecedented quantities. In 1918, $1 bought for Reichsmarks. By 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion Reichsmarks. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice a day and rushed to spend their wages before they became worthless. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Life savings evaporated overnight. The middle class was destroyed. This wasn't gradual debasement like Rome, it was hyperinflation. But the mechanism was the same. The government needed money. It couldn't raise taxes or cut spending without political collapse, so it printed and printed and printed until the currency died. The pattern is always the same. Empires start with sound money backed by gold or silver. This builds trust and enables trade. The empire grows, but growth brings costs. Military expansion, infrastructure, bureaucracy, eventually costs exceed revenues. Empires face a choice: raise taxes and risk rebellion, cut spending and risk collapse, or debase the currency and buy time. Debasement is politically safer. The costs are hidden. Most people don't understand what's happening until it's too late. And there's another factor. Debasement benefits the empire in the short term. When Rome reduced silver content, it could mint more coins, pay soldiers, fund projects, maintain power. The negative effects, inflation and economic instability, came later, often under a different ruler. So emperors chose short-term survival over long-term stability. This incentive structure is built into imperial finance. Empires expand beyond their sustainable capacity. They make promises they can't keep. They fight wars they can't afford. And when the bill comes due, they debase. Every single time. Modern nations follow a familiar pattern. In 1971, the United States left the gold standard and the dollar became a pure fiat currency. Since then, the money supply has soared by over 800%. The dollar you hold today is worth just a fraction of what it was back in 1971, and it's not just the US. Other nations have followed suit. Every major currency is now fiat. Every central bank prints money to fund government spending. Now, the methods are a lot more sophisticated than the old Roman practice of coin clipping, but the result is exactly the same. And just like those ancient empires, modern governments will tell you they have no other choice. They claim deficits are necessary for growth, that stimulus prevents recessions, and that quantitative easing stabilizes markets. But if you look past all the economic jargon, it's the same old story. The state needs money. Raising taxes is politically unpopular. So, they debase the currency and just hope that nobody notices. The big difference is that ancient empires debased their currency until they collapsed. Modern states, however, have managed to keep this going for decades. Why? Well, partly because fiat currency is more flexible. Partly because our global economy is much more complex. But mostly, it's because people accept it. We believe our currency has value simply because the government says it does. And as long as that belief holds, the system keeps chugging along. But history suggests that this belief eventually shatters. Rome's currency collapsed when people stopped trusting it. The hyperinflation in Weimar Germany ended when people simply refused to use the Reichsmark anymore. In fact, every single fiat currency in history has eventually failed. It's not usually because of some external shock, but because governments just couldn't resist the temptation to print more and more money. The pattern is crystal clear. Empires start strong. They expand aggressively. They overextend themselves financially. Then, to survive, they debase their currency. This leads to inflation and economic decline, and eventually, they either collapse or contract significantly. The timeline varies, of course. Rome took centuries. Weimar took just 5 years. But the mechanism is always the same. Understanding this pattern completely changes how you view modern finance. When you see central banks printing trillions, you'll realize it's not stimulus, it's debasement. When inflation starts to rise, you'll know it's not just supply chain issues. It's the inevitable result of expanding the money supply. And when governments claim that deficits don't matter, you'll recognize they are repeating the same lie every empire has told throughout history. They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme here is loud and clear. Empires always debase their currency. Not because they want to, but because the system they've built gives them no other choice. And when you truly understand that, you understand the endgame. It's not a question of if, but when. If this gave you a new perspective, hit that subscribe button. History has all the answers. You just have to be willing to look for them. Thanks for watching.